everything happened so fast that I just didn't even say anything. Wasn't too sure I seen it. I just was hoping something would come out on the film, which it did. So it come in at fantastic speed.
You're listening to Gailey Peck, a pilot, describing his sighting of a UFO, or flying saucer. Call it what you may, the question remains, do they or don't they exist? One might imagine that in our so-called scientifically enlightened society, that the mere existence or non-existence of a material object could be easily resolved. But as of now, the resolution of the UFO question still seems as remote as a politician's promise for a tax cut. In fact, the whole question of UFOs has turned into a hotly debated potpourri of governmental denyings, eyewitnesses' fervent eyings, plus the scientific cold shoulder. To all of this is added the not-so-savory flavor of frauds and psychopaths who have suddenly found a new way to gratify their needs. Out of this has come an aura of seemingly calculated confusion that quickly surrounds those looking for answers to the UFO riddle. It's into this confusion that we have delved, and what we've found may surprise and even shock you. When UFOs first started making the scene, it didn't take long for a host of hucksters to discover that every time they claimed a saucer sighting, there were hundreds of people who were willing to listen and to pay. But it didn't stop there, for the profiteers found that the more occult and mysterious their stories, the more they could extract from their followers. So, miracle of miracles, almost overnight, dozens of cults have mushroomed from the soil of easy money, ignorance, and UFO sightings. The leaders of many of these groups claim to be contactees. Now, contactee, as most UFO buffs will tell you, is someone that has actually contacted and communicated with the intelligences that man the outer space saucers. It should be mentioned that the majority of these contactees don't trifle at having just one contact with UFOs. Oh, no. This is a frightfully low score, as one self-claimed contactee now tells us.
Why, I saw my first flying saucer back in 1956 when it landed in the Santa Rosa Mountains there in California. Well, since that time, I think I've had over 55 sightings personally, but I can receive messages from them just about any time I want to. That is, if they're in the area at all.
Some people have all the luck. Then I've got a stiff neck, and the only thing I've been able to see is the Echo satellite making its round. How do the self-avowed UFO contactees communicate with the masters of the saucers? Well, telepathically, of course. As a case in point, I talked to two women in their late 50s who had attended a UFO meeting that was sponsored by a man who represents himself as a telepathic contactee. Incidentally, about 65% of his following are elderly or middle-aged women. Both women expressed disappointment and outrage toward the contactee because his meeting turned out to be a religious cult gathering more than the meeting of people interested in getting facts on UFOs. But they said their real outrage came after the meeting, when he called all of the women visitors, or those who wished to go individually, to his back office to receive an esoteric message sent from a telepathic being hovering unseen in his spacecraft over the night-shrouded meeting hall. As one of the women described the experience.
When I got back there, he told me to be seated, and when he sat down, he went into what I would call a trance. He got quite an unusual, well, he had an unusual appearance. It almost frightened me. Then he started scribbling something sporadically on a piece of paper. When he came out of this trance, he told me that he had received a message from a friend visiting from another galaxy. Oh, this message was especially for me, he said. I was just getting ready to see what the message was, and he told me first I had to come over close to him, and, well, he wanted me to kiss him as a bond of secret fellowship.
She refused and hasn't been back since. But till this day, she pulls out that well-worn piece of paper and tries to discern exactly what the message really is. To say that all people who claim telepathic communication with flying saucers are frauds or psychopaths would be like saying that all men with beards are beatniks. After all, according to research completed at Duke University, telepathy is a very real thing. Physicists also tell us that the human brain emits an electrical current they call a de Broglie wave. So you say, all right, so there's a possibility that telepathy is real. That doesn't make telepathic communication with flying saucers real, does it? Or for that matter, it doesn't even make flying saucers real. Well, you're right, it doesn't. But even the irredoubtable Air Force has publicly stated that they can't prove that the UFOs don't exist. So here we are with at least the equal chance that they might exist. And if they do exist, we would probably have to admit by the very fact of their being here from some distant sphere that they are somewhat advanced technologically. Telepathic communication? Who knows? For those of you who would like to hear what our outer space friends are saying when they communicate with their earthly contacts, I've included an interview with Major Wayne Aho, a self-styled telepathic contactee who says he received telepathically what he feels is a very significant message. He got the message while standing just a few feet from a flying saucer that landed in the Mojave Desert in 1957.
I was shown things of the future of this earth. It was like a look into the future. I was shown by these beings and by that experience on the night of May 11, 1957, that our civilization is in great danger. I was shown these words and actually walked this experience out, an all-night experience from 10:30 at night until dawn the next morning with the ship nearby. These words, your civilization is on the edge of a precipice, and only the spiritually motivated people can guide your civilization or a remnant of it through the critical days ahead. That is what I was told in my consciousness by an outside being, an outside voice, and I heard it clearly in my own consciousness. This experience was repeated, the crisis of the civilization, the second time, just a little ways farther in my night walk, my night experience. And the second time they said these words, the responsibility is very great. There is no room for mistakes. Now, I feel that I was shown that our civilization is going to go through two especially critical periods, and that we need to be very careful and how we handle and how we do things through that time, because the whole civilization might go over the dam.
You may have noted that Mr. Aho claimed to have received this message that admonished him to be spiritually motivated in 1957. It also is interesting to know that 2 years later in Oklahoma, Major Aho was associated with Otis T. Carr in selling stock in a saucer-like craft that they told their investors was going to the moon. Well, the saucer didn't go to the moon. In fact, it didn't even get off the ground. But after Carr and his associates had sold a reported $50,000 worth of stock in their non-flying saucer, the United States Securities and Exchange Commission obtained an injunction halting their stock-selling activities. During the Securities and Exchange Commission's investigation, Carr took the Fifth Amendment no less than 84 times, and Aho 11 times. So even though Mr. Aho forgot to mention exactly which spirit it is that was motivating him, apparently this spirit left him speechless when the Securities Commission wanted some straight answers. Well, Mr. Aho appears to be motivated again, for he's doing plenty of talking about flying saucers now, and more people than ever are listening. How does the world of science feel about UFOs? Well, it varies somewhat, but generally speaking, they're as cautious and as cold as a Scrooge at Christmas time. Good examples of the scientific cold front were displayed when I called the astronomy department of the University of Washington. I first contacted by phone Dr. Theodore S. Jacobson. When I asked him for his opinion of unidentified flying objects, he answered in frostbitten tones, "I have no observations about them. I have no feelings at all. Goodbye." I was so underwhelmed by his coolness that at the time I thought I might have been connected to the university's computer by mistake. I hadn't been. Hoping that this attitude wouldn't pervade the entire astronomy department, I contacted the information center, where they assured me a warm and lengthy interview would be granted by Dr. George Wallerstein of the astronomy department. I called Dr. Wallerstein and asked if I could get any information at all on UFOs, pro, con, or neutral. His reply? Well, that's a lot of nonsense. I don't even want to get involved in it. I think you'll understand my position. I said, no, I wasn't sure that I did. That ended our conversation. The anti-UFO cold front even extends across the Atlantic. Dr. Bernard Lovell, the British astronomer who directs the largest radio telescope in England, says of the UFOs, quote, "Any suggestion that these are visitors from outer space I regard as most unscientific and utter nonsense," unquote. He was quoted later in his lecture tour of the United States as saying that UFOs were strictly an American phenomenon, seemingly alluding to the idea that the rest of the world is too level-headed to fall for such poppycock. and he might try reading the newspapers occasionally. It might be a revelation to him to find that France, Australia, England, and a dozen other countries have contributed regularly their share of UFO sightings. But then, maybe nobody has told these other countries that UFOs just appear exclusively in America. And imagine the embarrassment of the Chilean government when they hear Lovell's statement. For the government and scientists of Chile have officially stated that UFOs literally exist. So, the scientific cold front is not completely solid, and of this, you'll hear more. Even though the Air Force outwardly plays the coy game of trying to discredit all UFO sightings, there are ample indications that they are more convinced than not of the reality of UFOs. In fact, the Air Force's much publicized, gee whiz, all these people must be seeing things attitude is belied by their handling of some of the UFO sightings. As a case in point, Major D.B. Reeder of Hamilton Air Force Base interviewed Mr. Sid Patrick, a man who claims to have actually been on a flying saucer for over 2 hours. Mr. Patrick was admonished after the Air Force interview not to reveal certain details about the spacecraft on which he rode. Now, doesn't it seem strange that the Air Force would be so concerned about the details of something they don't even believe exists? Well, so you can decide for yourself about this Watsonville, California man's extraordinary account of his ride on a space vehicle, I arranged an interview with him. Here now is my interview with Mr. Sid Patrick.
This one night I had gotten up to operate my ham radio, which I have done many times in the past up until this time. And this night was nothing unusual in this respect. And I got up to operate my ham radio at first, but then decided to go to the beach, and this incident happened. I left about 15 minutes before 2 to go down to the beach, and this craft came down right at 2 o'clock.
Could you describe somewhat how it happened?
I could describe it in saying this. On the first sighting of it, and realizing it wasn't something I'd ever seen before, it scared me very badly. I mean, tremendously. I think it scared me so bad I couldn't even run. And I stood and watched it, and the people started talking to me as they came down. And it did relieve me to some degree because they indicated they were not hostile. And they furthermore invited me aboard. And with my little bit of curiosity, plus the fact I was so frightened I couldn't do anything, I decided to go aboard. And I met the gentleman as I went in the door.
And you said they started to talk to you as they came down. Was this through a speaker system?
I can't answer that. I know the voice that he was using came from that general direction, but I could not classify it as a speaker. It appeared to be a natural voice coming right out of the air. I cannot say it was a concentrated voice like a speaker would ordinarily give you.
You were the only one, as far as you know, that was on the beach at that time.
I'm the only one in that area that I know of. And for this reason, I know I'm the only one because I didn't know at first they were directing this voice to me. I didn't know if they were directed to me or anyone else, so I had to look around and see, and I appeared to be the only one in the area. Although, I might tell you, too, this area, although there's a lot of houses right in the immediate area, they're usually not occupied during the wintertime, and this was in the winter, of course.
Sid Patrick told of a spaceship that was so unusual that he felt for sure that it was from out of this world.
It was large. It looked a lot larger than it probably was, but I guessed it to be around 30 feet high and about 70 feet across when it came down, and I looked at it twice now, in fact 3 times, once when I went aboard, and once up in the hills where he dropped me off and let me out for a few seconds. We were in the hills, incidentally, almost 2 hours, where I don't know. And then he took me back and dropped me off the same place he picked me up, and I watched it leave, and it was every bit of 70 feet across and 30 feet high.
Did this have any particular shape?
Yes, it did, a very peculiar shape, and I have seen since then actual photographs that coincide with this exact shape that they had. And it would be an oblong shape, like something on the egg-shaped, and with a big rim around it, appearing to be something like a gyro.
Now, when they invited you in, did you have to climb up over some cowling or some rim to get into the craft itself?
No, I didn't. Actually, when they invited me aboard, they were close to the ground when they invited me the second time, and they came down close enough. I think they came down just within a foot or so and just held the craft there. This is what it appeared to be, although I did not look and I cannot be sure. But it was low enough to where I could step right inside of it very comfortably. I mean, with a normal pace of stepping.
Then there was some aperture at the bottom whereby you could get in from the bottom of the craft.
Oh, yes. I would just walk straight in the room. When I got inside the craft, I just walked straight forward until I met this gentleman.
Now, did things inside the craft look normal to you, or was it completely out of what you had ever conceived?
It was so abnormal, I thought I was dead for a while. This is a fact. I actually couldn't conceive of me being standing there in front of craft like this and walking inside of it and seeing something I had never come in contact with before. And at this time, I knew it was not anything from this earth, or at least I didn't think so. I had never seen anything to coincide with it. Cannot tell you what it was made out of, although I can tell you what it looked like. The inside looked like it was plastic all the way. I mean, I did not see anything that would indicate it being metal or any metallic substance. But whatever it was it appeared to be very hard and very solid. A lot harder than what we would ordinarily make plastic or plexiglass on that order. It was not transparent, however. This is what it appeared to me. It looked like some kind of a plastic material with a coloring to it. The reason I say that is the lighting all came through the walls, and it was the lighting was equalized throughout the craft, very much equalized, where there was no dark spots or unilluminated spots. Even the ceilings were lit up, just like the walls, although the floors did not have lights in them. And this is what made me think they were transparent. Now, I'm not so sure how they lighted the walls. I didn't ask him how they did it.
I asked Mr. Patrick what he thought the purpose of the UFO crew was in picking him up and taking him on a tour through their craft.
I asked him just before I departed from the craft what their purpose was for being here, and he told me observation only, but it is generally assumed, not only by myself but others, that he could have meant for me to observe him, because it was obvious all through this 2-hour encounter that he did not want to know anything about me. He didn't ask me one question about my life, my age, my family, or the country, or anything, as if just he knew it already.
What was some of the text of your conversation? Did you ask him questions?
Oh, I asked him a total of 25 questions altogether that I could remember asking him when I got off. And he gave me direct, specific answers, too. I did ask him a few questions, however, which he did not answer. And I don't know why he didn't. I didn't ask him why he didn't answer.
Such as?
Well, I asked him one if he would compare their light term with our day or mile or week or month or whatever the case may be, and he would not do it for me. Why? I don't know. He would not tell me.
You remember another question that he wouldn't answer?
That was one in particular I asked him. Oh, and then the power source, too. I asked him if he would tell me a little more specifically about their power source, and he refused to do that also. Those two things I know he would not answer.
Sid Patrick recalled for me 2 questions that his visitors from outer space answered.
And I also asked him where he was from, and this is how he gave it to me. He said that they were from a planet in back of a planet which we observe, but we do not observe them. Now, he carefully worded that by saying we do not observe him rather than we could not observe him.
Did you happen to ask whether they believed in a God or a Christ?
I didn't ask him, but he volunteered it. I might tell you this, that throughout the encounter, he took me on 2 floors of the craft. The bottom floor had 7 rooms he took me into, and also the second floor had 7 rooms, which made a total of 14 rooms throughout the encounter. Now, I am assuming, however, since the craft was 30 feet high, around 30 feet high, that there was another floor he didn't take me aboard. I didn't think to ask him if there was another floor because we were moving too fast and talking all the time, and it didn't even register on me until I got out of the craft that there must have been another floor. And he took me in a room they called their consultation room, and he volunteered to tell me their way of life in this room. And this is when he mentioned the supreme deity and the fact that there is a God. And he started out this way. As soon as we had gotten in the room, he asked me for the first time if I would like to sit down. And I think I had been in the craft over an hour at this time, well over an hour. And of course, I hadn't worried about sitting down. I didn't need to. I mean, we were just walking and talking all the time. And when he did ask me if I'd like to sit down, I did do so just for a few seconds and sat down from, maybe a minute to a minute and a half and felt the chair real good and got up and stood back with him. And I thought we were about ready to leave, but we by no means left the room immediately. And then he asked me if I would like to pay my respects to the supreme deity. And when he said that, I didn't know just how to accept it. I know we have a supreme deity, but I asked him point blank, I said, you said supreme deity. Why would you say that? I said, we have a supreme deity, but we call him God. Are we talking about the same thing? And he said, there is only one. That's the only answer he gave me. There is only one.
As far as finding official governmental or scientific confirmation that UFOs do in fact exist or not exist, precious little can be found. I contacted 2 Air Force bases, talked to a major and a colonel respectively. Both of them were in charge of Project Blue Book, the Air Force's code name for the project to identify the unidentified objects. Both stated they could not and would not make any statements concerning UFOs. Where do you have to go to get a statement of any kind from the Air Force? To the top, and Major Hector Quintanilla, Jr., the man who heads up Project Blue Book. But even here, where some answers are given, specifics are neatly avoided. Major Quintanilla, in a statement released to the general press, states that the vast majority of UFO sightings have involved simple misinterpretation of natural phenomena. He goes on to say that less than 2% of the sightings so far checked out are listed on Project Blue Book's file as unidentified. So the official conclusion offered to the public is this, that none of the 2% has given any indication of posing a threat to national safety, or of offering new technological data, or of originating from some extraterrestrial source. Then, as a calculated face-saving escape clause, the Air Force ends their official statement with, however, some of these files remain officially open, and the investigations on them continue. If the Air Force is as naive as they claim to be concerning UFOs, they would do well to listen to an incident that concerns Air Force planes, Air Force personnel, dispatched from the Air Force's very own Elmendorf Air Force Base in Alaska. This incident is told by a highly regarded engineer who was employed by the United States government. He asked to remain anonymous. His reasons will become self-evident.
When I was a little boy, about 12, 13 years old, which was about 50 years ago, 2 other Boy Scouts and I spent a night out in the mountains camping. And we were lying there. I spotted them first, or it first. There were 5 stars up in the sky, almost directly overhead, and 4 of them were motionless, but one was going through some of the most fantastic, unbelievable gyrations. I mean, it didn't make sense, and so I nudged the other 2 boys, woke them, and we laid there for, I guess, a half an hour watching this one star in particular going through. It was moving both vertically and then descending and then from side to side, but it was staying within these other cluster of 4 stars until finally, much to the disbelief almost of the 3 of us, all 5 of them just, and they were gone. And never, I thought, well, you know, as a youngster, we thought they were shooting stars, but there was still something that didn't register in the back of my mind until a good many years later. I had never heard of flying saucers or UFOs or anything of the kind. My wife and daughter and I were going up over the Alaska Highway. And we met and became acquainted with a young Air Force officer who also was going up to be assigned at Elmendorf Air Force Base. I won't mention his name. At the time it was very hush-hush, but considerable has happened since then. But I will say this much, that we, through our acquaintance with him, I think got authentic information. He was working on the project for the identification of unidentified flying objects. And what we heard from him confirmed in my subconscious mind, this little thing that had been hanging back there about these stars that I'd seen as a little boy, that I had actually observed in unidentified flying objects or a group of spaceships. This Air Force officer, when we first met him going up the highway, he was very skeptical of his assignment. Pooh-pooh, unidentified flying objects, there ain't no such animal, and that sort of thing. But in the year or more during which he was in this investigation, he became convinced that there was something in it, because many of the pilots who were assigned to the job of observing these objects, of which there were many sighted during this period in Alaska, they were permitted to approach quite closely as observers. Eventually, the commanding general gave instructions to shoot one of these UFOs down, A total of 3 such orders were issued, and a total of 3 pilots and planes disappeared completely and have never been seen since. After the third one, the instructions were then given that they were to observe only. It certainly made a believer out of this skeptical Air Force officer.
This incident made a believer of one Air Force officer, but evidently not of Major Quintanilla. But then, maybe this report has been misplaced somewhere in a stack of red tape. Only the Air Force knows, and they're not talking. Have the number of UFO sightings increased recently, or have they been consistent over the years? For this and other answers, we went to William A. Giabonini, Director of Aeronautics for the Washington State Aeronautics Commission.
Yes, there are many more calls. In the past 2-3 weeks, we've received quite a number of calls. In fact, so much so that the civilian defense has taken on the responsibility of compiling the listing of the calls.
Do the people who call about UFOs seem to fit into any particular category?
Well, actually, they fit into many categories, but 90% of the calls that we received are from women. I don't know whether it's because the husbands are working there during the course of the day, but most of our calls are from women.
I asked if the Commission tried to determine if the UFO sightings were legitimate or not.
We're not in a position to decide this. This is not our... We're a compiling agency. This is not our position to make the decision as to whether they are fact or fiction.
One of the women that had called Mr. Giabonini's office about a UFO sighting was Mrs. Moselle Ross. Mrs. Ross, slim, in her late 20s, lives in a newly completed hillside home with her husband and 2 young sons. I visited their home twice to get the details of a fascinating story, a story that hasn't ended yet. To appreciate fully the UFO sightings that occurred from the Ross's home, you should understand that their house commands an unobstructed view of a lush wooded valley rimmed by a high ridge. With binoculars, you can easily trace a treeless swath that cuts through the valley and along the rim of the ridge. Within this swath are cradled giant structures carrying high-voltage Bonneville power lines. I mention the power lines because among some experts, there's a growing feeling that there is a correlation between UFO sightings and high-voltage lines. According to Mrs. Ross, the first sightings occurred in December, about 6 p.m. Her sister-in-law saw it first, and before it had disappeared, 6 house guests had witnessed that particular UFO. She described it as being about the size of a football with a very, very bright white glow. She said she thought it was a star at first, but they collectively decided later that a star wouldn't be making gyrations like a yo-yo and hovering only 50 or 60 feet from their front window. Mr. Ross thought it was some test being conducted by the Boeing Aircraft Company. That is, he did then, for that was only the first of many sightings. After that, they had 18 sightings within 21 days. How many people saw the very bright white blobs? According to Mrs. Ross, quite a few. Between 7 and 70 people were at the Ross home the second and third evening after the first sighting. They all saw the saucer, or whatever it was. According to Mrs. Ross, the group included several people from the sheriff's office, a man who was introduced to the Rosses by a sheriff as a scientist. They didn't catch his name. And a host of friends, neighbors, and UFO buffs. The proof of their being there, the people that is, was all over the Rosses' freshly painted deck that overlooked the valley. The Rosses had it painted again to cover all the footprints. The next sighting was more exciting. This UFO was huge, about 10 yards across the bottom, and it glowed eerily with bright red and green pulsating lights. It hovered near the back of the Rosses' home for many hours. How many hours? Mrs. Ross doesn't know. She was so frightened she pulled the curtain and went to bed. Following nights, as witnessed by the Rosses and others, saw the object land near the power line ridge and emit a fantastically bright light. I talked to a sheriff's deputy that had witnessed them. He said the Air Force had requested reports on the Ross sightings. Did he think they were real objects? You bet he did. The Rosses thought their troubles were over. For 2 months, nothing happened. Then all of a sudden, saucers have shown up again. What does the saucer-weary Mrs. Ross think about the new sightings?
They'll cruise, and then they'll go up and down occasionally, and this is all. They're not as spectacular as the ones were before.
For the good old days when we had spectacular UFOs. Of all of the thousands of UFO sightings that have been reported, it's very conceivable that many of them are just what the Air Force seems intent on having us think they are, natural phenomena or hallucinations. There's a classic type of sighting, however, that sometimes involves as many as 4 out of our 5 basic senses, plus the frequent occurrence of mechanical or electrical defects that come upon the vehicle that the person sighting the UFO is driving. Under normal circumstances, it's difficult to imagine that all of these perceptions are but hallucinations. There are hundreds of reports of this nature that have singularly parallel points. As most of the reports go, the car usually comes to a sudden halt, not the brake screeching type, but more like running into a huge downy pillow. The electrical and ignition system dies, and of course, these two phenomena are usually accompanied by the actual visual sighting of a UFO or saucer-like craft. Some reports indicate that just a faint overhead humming or whirring was heard, and a few stated that there was a trace of ozone-like odor discernible during the incident. Are all of the reports of this type hallucination or just plain falsehood? Well, maybe. So I checked to get any information I could. I readily found 6 such sightings that had been publicly reported within a 50-mile radius of my office. I checked on the authenticity of several of the sightings. That is, as much as you can check on the authenticity of something of this nature. My check included verifying with neighbors, friends, and employers about the basic honesty and character of the person who claimed the sighting, and their possible motives, if any, for reporting a UFO. I found several sightings that had every indication of being authentic. I've included portions of one of these interviews. Listen carefully as Mrs. Josephine Brundage tells of her night of surprise and fear.
I got off work at 11 o'clock, and I had come through Kent. I was approximately 5 miles out of Kent. I always pass this grocery store, which is Foss's grocery store, and I always make a left-hand turn at Foss's grocery store. And at the time I hadn't realized this, but I had gone past this turn. I had gone approximately 1 block past the store where I just, from nowhere, the car was just stopped right in the road. And my first thought was that I had hit something in the road, and I didn't really realize at the time there was no jolt or any movement of the car at all. When I finally realized I was stopped, I thought, whatever it is, I've hit something to make me stop. And then when I saw this object, I thought, well, whatever I've hit, it threw it to the top of the car. And then when it started hovering over the car, I knew that I must not have hit it, because otherwise it wouldn't be spinning like it was. And my next thought was that it could have possibly been what they call a shooting star. But then I thought, too, after that when those things land, that's all of it. They're just gone, from what I've heard. So I didn't actually know what it was. I just kept my eyes on it, and it just kept moving around in the same direction.
Mrs. Brundage described the object that circled over the hood of her car.
You know how a child's top will be more or less thin at the top and sort of circle, and then come down sort of like to a, not quite to a peak, but you know how I mean, like a child, one of these toy tops that the children play with. And it just spun real slow. Only a child's top will go faster than what this was going. It had an orange glow to it, just sort of like fire, but yet it didn't look like fire. It was just, you know, the color of fire. The whole thing was completely covered, you know, of this orange glow. The more I watched it, the more I was more or less under its spell, it seemed like, because I couldn't even move. All I could do was just watch it. And I just kept thinking to myself, what is it? What does it want, and why doesn't it go away?
It did go away in approximately 2 minutes. It was then that Mrs. Brundage noticed that her radio, lights, and car clock had been off. They came on in a few minutes, and after some difficulty, she got her car started. Imagination? Well, maybe. But the next day, the car battery was dead, and Mr. Brundage was very sure of the reality of it when he had to spend $20 hard-earned on a new battery. The old one was damaged beyond the point of recharging. Literally, one of the most shocking stories to come out of the UFO proliferation is that of James Flynn of East Fort Myers, Florida. Jimmy, as his friends call him, still wears a badge on his forehead that proves that something, somehow, administered a mighty shock to his system. What's the badge Jimmy wears? It's a welt-like thickening of skin over his right eye. And according to the reports of doctors who examined him, in the center of the welt is a depressed, slightly abraded spot about 1 centimeter in diameter. How did Jimmy Flynn receive the shock that put him in a hospital for 10 days? I called him long distance to find out. It turned out to be one of the most bizarre UFO stories I've heard. Yet after many of the facts were in, one of the most credible. This UFO episode began on March 12, 1965, when James Flynn and his 4 hunting dogs embarked on a swamp buggy into the Everglades at a point about halfway between Fort Myer and Miami, Florida. Their mission? To hunt wild turkeys. They found a lot more than that.
In the late afternoon, just before dark, one of the old dogs and 2 of the puppies jumped a deer. The old dog came back, but the 2 puppies didn't come back. They got lost. So I built up a fire and sat waiting on them, and they didn't come back. About 12 o'clock at night, I heard somebody shoot up in the direction that I heard the 2 young dogs last running. So I figured somebody had shot my dogs for a deer or something like that. So I cranked up my buggy and headed up in that direction with my headlight on. So I had gone about a mile probably, and I saw this light up about 300 foot in the air above the cypress trees. So I sat there for a little bit, and I watched it go. When I first saw it, it was going northeast. And I lost it. I couldn't see it any longer, and a little bit, well, it came back to where I had almost originally seen it.
Mr. Flynn said he wasn't frightened at the time because he thought it might be a helicopter. The game wardens in the Everglades use copters all the time. He then lost sight of it. Waited a few minutes, then suddenly the glowing object rose from the cypress trees. He skillfully steered his swamp buggy through scattered cypress heads. When he broke out into the clear, he was only about a quarter of a mile from the object. He stopped his swamp buggy, took out his binoculars, a pair of 7x35s, and sat and watched this glowing sphere for 30 to 40 minutes. It was like having a grandstand seat. The view was perfect. The details clear. Exactly what did James Flynn see that March night in the Florida swamps? And equally important, what happened to James Flynn after he saw what he saw?
The thing was a cone shape, and it was approximately 32 or 33 foot high. And I'll explain to you how I can get those measurements later on. But it started from the bottom of it, as I say, on a cone shape. About 16 foot up, it started with a tier of windows. And above that tier of windows was another tier of windows. Above that one was another tier of windows. Above that one was another tier of windows. There was 4 tier of windows, and from the top tier of windows to the cone top of it was about 8 foot. From around those windows was a dull yellow light, like you would have a bulb outside to ward off mosquitoes or something like that. The light didn't shine directly out. It shone down beside the ship. From around the base of the ship was a deep red light, like from the exhaust, which is where the exhaust came from. So I sat there and watched it for about, I'd say, 30 to 40 minutes. I cranked up, turned on my light, and headed on up to the ship. But as one of my dogs left, he come back, was in the buggy, and he started howling and carrying on so until I shut the buggy off about 250 yards from it, got off, and walked on up to the ship. And as I was standing there, just about, the light was just coming over the top of my head. I was approximately 75 from 80 foot. The light was coming, I was standing in the light at the bottom of the ship. Wind from the ship was just something like would come from a jet or something that she was standing by. I was having difficulty standing up even at that distance from it. Well, I stood there about a half a minute, looking up to where the windows were, and I waved, and nothing didn't happen. I stood there probably another half a minute, and waved again. And that's the last thing that I know. Some kind of a light that came from just beneath the bottom tier windows, looked like a sharp pencil light about 6 inches long, about the size of a pencil. Struck me and hit me right between the eyes.
James Flynn was unconscious for about 24 hours, or this is the estimation they made after he arrived in the hospital. As James Flynn describes it, here's what happened after he came to.
When I came to, I couldn't see. I was blind in both eyes. When I come to, I couldn't see, so I could hear the dog in the buggy out there scratching and trying to get out. So I crawled around, and I don't know if that was in the night or in the daytime, but the next morning when I got to where I could see a little bit, well, it was just, the sun was just coming up. So I made it over to my buggy and got me something out to eat, turned my old dog out, And I made it into the Indian reservation, which was about 18 miles from there. And I got one of the Indians to drive me out to the, come with me to the road. And by that time, my left eye was coming back pretty good. I could see, you know, fairly good out of my left eye. So I made it on into the hospital, and there I was in the hospital about 10 days before I got to where I could see out of my right eye. In fact, they wouldn't let me see then. They kept it patched up.
James Flynn was examined by a team of leading eye doctors and physicians. One of the physicians was so convinced by what he heard and saw that he went back with James and others to the spot where the pencil beam and saucer had wrought such a profound effect upon Mr. Flynn. Dr. Stipe took pictures, which he still has, of a fresh burn area and scorched treetops in a perfect circle. Conclusive proof that UFOs exist? The critics say no. But it does prove one thing, that the whole story wasn't just James Flynn's imagination. Did the Air Force help Mr. Flynn by investigating the sighting or provide any answers to the riddle? Well, I'll let James Flynn answer that.
I called the deputy sheriff. Deputy sheriff called the FBI, and he referred it to the Homestead Air Force Base in Homestead, Florida, which they have a team of investigators who investigate these things. All right, they made out like that they were really interested in going down there to investigate it. Well, when I saw that I was going to be able to get out of the hospital, the deputy sheriff called him and notified him that we were ready to go. And they told him that if we would take some lines and mark the area off where they could fit there, they would fly a team in there and investigate it, which we did. We hauled 2 bags of lime over that terrain, which you don't dare carry any more than you have to because it's so foggy and wet down there. We took about 40 pictures. We took soil samples. I mailed them soil samples, and we mailed them a copy of the pictures that we had and wrote them. They never had the courtesy to even send back the pictures. They never had the courtesy to let us know from the soil samples or never even answered any of our letters.
James Flynn and a half dozen others gave of their valuable time to wade through dangerous swamp areas to mark the UFO landing site, to help the Air Force. But it seems that the Air Force didn't want to help James Flynn. What gives the Air Force the right to such blatant rudeness? Well, here again we can only guess. But their rather clumsy evasion tactics only further convince James Flynn and a steadily growing number of people like him that the question is no longer, do flying saucers exist? But rather, why are they here and where do they come from?